Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I am Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriots History of the United States with Mike Allen. I'm also the author of Patriots History of Globalism. Just came out last week. Grab your copy now. We have great offers up at the Wild World of History, including autographed copies, packages that include Globalism and Patriots History, Globalism, Reagan, Dragon Slayers. So take a look at all the offers that are up there. I think you'll like them. Okay, this is lesson 110, Dred Scott, from the chapter A House Dividing, chapter 8. I'm reading from the 15th anniversary edition. Again, the 20th anniversary edition is available. If you want a copy, here's what you got to do. Subscribe to Wild World of History VIP or Wild World of Politics Insider. When you do that, write me an email at larry@wildworldofhistory.com, and I will send you the PDF. It contains a full new chapter, about, 40 pages if typeset, and it contains maybe 20 or 30 pages of new insertions, additions, and new research. Great stuff. So if you want that, just become a subscriber, and we'll get it to you right away. Okay, as kind of a review, we've been talking about the pendulum swinging here back and forth between the North and the South. And every time it looks like one side is winning, something happens to upset the apple cart and throw things back entirely the opposite direction. So, for example, Texas was admitted as a state. This was a big gain for the South. But very shortly thereafter, the War with Mexico occurred. And as part of the victory in the war against Mexico, the United States got California, which came into the Union as a free state, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona territories that people thought would probably be free states. So the South had to get something for that because the pendulum swung way back toward the North. And the abolitionists, by admitting California as a free state and possibly these other three free states. So New Mexico, Arizona hadn't been broken up yet, but it was going to be. Anyway, as part of that compromise, the South got the fugitive slave law that said basically Northerners had to participate in helping Southerners capture runaway slaves. And this really worked against the moral ethos of Northerners. The South thought they won a great victory, but shortly after that was passed, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that became a runaway bestseller. And all of a sudden, it looked like the pendulum shifted back to the North all over again. Then Stephen Douglas introduces a bill, the Nebraska Act, to create a free state of Nebraska so they could put a railroad to the Pacific through that. And the South was outraged. And as a result, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, was set up that gave the South another slave state, Kansas. So it looked like the South now had the pendulum with it again. But what happened in the result of Kansas was both sides, Southerners and Northerners, sent in people trying to pack the state with their own voters. And as a result, you had the sack of Lawrence, which is they tore up a newspaper office, and the Potawatomi Massacre, where John Brown and his sons killed some free soilers along Potawatomi Creek. And then shortly after that, you had the caning of Charles Sumner in the U.S. Senate right there on the floor. Preston Brooks almost beat him to death on the floor of the Senate. So you had chaos rather than a calm acceptance of another slave state. And this is what is getting to be concerning today, too, that we have one party, the Democrat, that won't respect a loss. If they now, you can say, well, they did that in 2020 with Republicans. They wouldn't respect a loss. And there are other things involved there. And, I can't say that on YouTube. They'll kick me off. But we all know that something was fishy in Denmark, right? Something smelled about that whole election. But Democrats are already making noises that when Trump wins, and he's going to win, when Trump wins, they're not going to accept it. They're not going to certify the vote, blah, blah, blah. Well, you're asking for trouble. You're asking for violence when you do that, you idiots. Just think twice about that, because that's what you're asking for. At any rate, we now come to the pendulum swinging back to the south with a gigantic legal decision. And so I'm on page 293 of the 15th anniversary edition. Remember, if you have an earlier edition, the page numbers might not line up. The headers usually will, but not always. So 293, and the header is Dred Scott's judicial earthquake. America had barely absorbed Buchanan's inaugural when 2 days later, the Supreme Court of the United States on March 6, 1857, set off a judicial earthquake. Buchanan had been made aware of the forthcoming decision. So let me repeat that. Buchanan had been made aware of how the court was going to rule. So you get all of these people who were saying that, it was unprecedented. What happened with the Dobbs decision, that parts of it were leaked. Well, leaked to the public, maybe, but leaked to other parts of government, no, nothing unusual about that, because Buchanan knew about this. He was made aware of the forthcoming decision, which he supported, and he included references to it in his inaugural address. The Dred Scott decision easily became one of the 2 or 3 most controversial high court cases in American history. I would argue the 3 worst were Dred Scott, Plessy Ferguson, and Roe v. Wade. Easily 3 worst decisions, not just in terms of the outcome, but in terms of the hideous legal reasoning. Dred Scott, the slave to a U.S. Army surgeon named John Emerson, moved with his master to Rock Island, Illinois in 1834. Scott remained with Emerson for 2 years on the Army base, even though Illinois, under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, prohibited slavery. In 1836, Emerson was assigned to Fort Snelling in modern-day Minnesota, which is part of the Wisconsin Territory above the Missouri Compromise line, again taking Scott with him. At the time of Emerson's death in 1843, the estate, including Scott and his wife Harriet, went to Emerson's daughter. Meanwhile, members of the family who had owned Scott previously and who had by then befriended Scott brought a suit on behalf in St. Louis County, where he then resided, claiming his freedom. Scott took advantage of a Missouri law that recognized freedom suits in which slaves could file for wrongful enslavement if they had at any time been in a free state. Now, let's put a pin right there. When people get on their high horse, nobody says slavery was good. Nobody says slavery was good. It's horrible. Evil institution, needed to be destroyed as fast as possible. But in the context of the day, only America had states, slave states, Maryland and Missouri, that had freedom suits. So find that someplace else in the world. They didn't. No place else would allow a slave to actually go to court to sue for their freedom. Only the USA. Okay. Scott's suit argued that his residence in both Illinois and Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was prohibited, one by state law, one by the Missouri Compromise, and the principle of the Northwest Ordinance, made him free. A Missouri jury agreed in 1850. Emerson appealed to the Missouri Supreme Court, which in 1852 reversed the lower court ruling, arguing that the lower court had abused the principle of comity, by which one state agreed to observe the laws of another. The Constitution guaranteed that the citizen of one state had equal protection in all states. Hence the rub. If Scott was a citizen by virtue of being free in one state, federal law favored him. But if he was property, federal law favored the Emersons. And so what the Missouri Supreme Court was saying is that because of comity, the property requirements of slaves in the southern states had to be respected. In other words, they're getting very close to a definition of slavery as a piece of property. Refusing to rule on the constitutional status of slaves as either property or people, the Missouri court focused only on the comity issue. But that, of course, requires that you side with one part of the union over the other because they had different definitions of what property was. In the interim, Mrs. Emerson remarried and moved to Massachusetts, where her husband, Calvin Chaffee, later would win election to Congress as an anti-slavery know-nothing. Emerson left Scott in St. Louis, still the property of her brother, John Sanford, who himself had moved to New York. Scott, then having considerable freedom, initiated a new suit in his own name in 1853, bearing the now famous name Scott v. Sandford, S-A-N-D-F-O-R-D. The Sanford was misspelled in the official document. Now, one book I read recently suggests, why wasn't Mrs. Emerson the target here? Why was Sanford, who really had nothing to do with Scott? He technically owned Scott, but wasn't there. Why was this such a big deal that he take the case, that it be aimed at him? And the author, I thought, offered a very good assessment, which was because of Chaffee, the anti-slave guy who is now married to Mrs. Emerson. They didn't want to embarrass him. They didn't want to have Emerson's name on the suit. You know, here you're supposedly anti-slave and yet you're being sued by a slave for freedom. Why are you contesting it? So Sanford put his name on it at any rate. A circuit court ruled against Scott once again, and his lawyers appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. When the court heard the case in 1856, it had to rule on whether Scott could even bring the suit as a slave. The second point involved whether Scott's residence in a free state or in free federal territory made him free. In theory, the court had the option to duck the larger issues altogether merely by saying Scott was a slave and as such had no authority to even bring a suit. However, Missouri and Maryland had freedom suits that said if a slave thought they were wrongfully enslaved, they could bring a suit, indicating that even Missouri and Maryland were siding with the notion that a slave is a person because a chair cannot bring a lawsuit. However, the circuit court had already ruled that Scott could sue, and Scott, not Emerson, had appealed on different grounds. Now, let me see if we have anything more on this. Hold on. Yes, I do. There is new material in the 20th anniversary edition of Patriot's History, and so I'll read that to you now. So right after the line saying the Missouri court focused only on the comity issue in 293, we would add, ironically, the case only came forward because the Scots attorney made two critical mistakes that likely would have won the case outright, meaning it would not have gone to the Supreme Court at all. First, he led with the Dred Scott case as opposed to that of his wife, Harriet, which was a stronger case. Her owner had actually freed her, then personally married the Scots, which can only happen amongst free people. Each of these indicated freedom. Second, Scott's attorney failed to ever establish that they were actually slaves, providing only hearsay. The larger question is why the Scots sued John Sanford, who was not the executor of the estate and didn't own them. Sanford looked to keep his sister, Irene Emerson, and brother-in-law, prominent Massachusetts Congressman Calvin Chaffee, out of the news. It would not look good for a Massachusetts congressman to be sued for owning slaves. Now, this is from a new little book. It's a small book by David Hardy called Dred Scott, The Inside Story. Okay, hang on. Okay, a little bit more, and then we have some more new material. If ever a court was overcome by hubris, it was the Supreme Court of Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice from Maryland, who sided with his fellow Southerners' views of slavery. Far from dodging the monumental constitutional issues, Taney's 9 justices all rendered separate opinions whose combined effect produced an anti-slavery backlash that dwarfed that associated with the fugitive slave law. As far as the court was concerned, the case began as a routine ruling that the laws of Missouri were properly applied, and thus the court had no jurisdiction in the matter. And it might have washed through the pages of history like the tiniest piece of lint. Sometime in February 1857, however, the justices had a change of heart, brought about when they decided to write individual opinions. As it turned out, the 5 Southern justices wanted to overturn the Missouri Compromise, which they thought unconstitutional. In less than 3 weeks, the court had shifted from treating the Dred Scott case as a routine matter of state autonomy to an earth-shattering restatement of the constitutionality of slavery. So as I said, we have some new material here that we would add at the end of that statement, restatement of the constitutionality of slavery. And that line is, and it did so by completely ignoring the Somerset principle in English law that never recognized property in man. That's really all I wanted to include there. Okay. Taney's decision, by the way, next time I will read the whole Dred Scott decision. Taney's decision included the position that freedmen were citizens of one state, but not of the United States. Nor could emancipated slaves or their progeny be free in all states, because a citizen had to be born a citizen, and no slaves were. He also dismissed, despite considerable precedent at the state level, any citizenship rights that states offered blacks. In other words, even if free, Taney said Scott could not bring the suit. Moving to free soil did not free Scott either, as the slaveholders could take their property into territories, and any act of Congress regarding slaves would be an impairment of property rights guaranteed in the Fifth Amendment. Scott's presence in Wisconsin Territory did not emancipate him either, because in Taney's view, the Missouri Compromise, as well as the Northwest Ordinance, was unconstitutional in that it violated the Fifth Amendment. And therefore, provisions of statute law over the territories were of no legal import. Forced by the weight of his own logic to admit that if a state so desired, it could grant citizenship to blacks, Taney still maintained that did not make them citizens of all states. Taney considered African Americans, quote, as a subordinate and inferior class of beings who had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. In other words, they are not fully human, according to Taney. Other members of the court agreed that Scott was not a citizen, and after years of begging by Congress to settle the territorial citizenship question, the court had indeed acted. Doubtless Southerners, and perhaps Taney himself, expected intense condemnation of the ruling. In that, Taney was not disappointed. The Northern press referred to the Jesuitical decision as, quote, a willful perversion and, quote, an atrocious crime. But no one foresaw the economic disaster the court had perpetuated as, once again, the law of unintended consequences took effect. Now, I've got to say, this is a piece of research I had a small part in. Around 1991, Professor Charles Calamiris of Northwestern University and I had been working from my Banking in the American South book and looking at a number of things. And we discovered something interesting about the Panic of 1857. Namely, it didn't seem to be caused by any economic circumstances. And so we determined to write a paper about that, which we did. And it came out first as a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper, and then it was submitted to the Journal of Economic History, where it was accepted and published. Charlie did the vast majority of the work. I don't think I contributed more than 10, 15%, but he insists that I did, and I got full co-credit. Charles Calamiris and Larry Swinehart. This has been, without a doubt, other than perhaps Patriot's history itself, the most cited thing I've ever done in my life. It is cited constantly in every paper about bank panics, about manias, about bank runs, destabilization of banks, branch banking, anything you can think of that has to do with banks, that paper is cited. We probably have thousands upon thousands of citations of that paper alone, which I didn't think would be that big a deal when we put it out. But that was in 91, and I'm pleased to say that so far, as of 2024, no other academic has successfully refuted our findings. And so it still stands up. So I will, rather than tell you what's in the paper, I'll read what we wrote here in Patriot's History. Unlike the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the politics of slavery had little to do with the expansion of the railroads. However, in the immediate aftermath of the Dred Scott ruling, the nation's railroad bonds, or at least a specific group of railroad bonds, tumbled badly. The Supreme Court ruling triggered the Panic of 1857, but for generations, historians have overlooked the key relationship between the Dred Scott case and the economic crisis, instead pinning the blame on changes in international wheat market and the economic dislocation stemming from the Crimean War. Had all railroad securities collapsed, such arguments might ring true, except that only certain railroad bonds plunged. Those roads primarily ran east and west. Businesses hate uncertainty, and above all, they dislike wars, which tend to upset markets and kill consumers. Prior to the Dred Scott case, railroad builders pushed westward, confident that either pro-slavery or free soil ideas would triumph. Whichever dominated, the market would be stable because of certainty. What the court's ruling did was to completely destabilize the markets. Suddenly, the prospect of appeared of a bleeding Kansas writ large, with the possibility of John Brown raids occurring in every new territory as it opened. Investors easily saw this, and the bonds for the east-west roads collapsed. As they fell, the collateral they represented for large banks in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia sank too. Banks immediately found themselves in an exposed and weakened condition, and a panic spread throughout the northern banking community. So, to sum up, if you're building a railroad and all of a sudden you've got to think, oh my gosh, I'm building right into the middle of a civil war. The pro-slavers and anti-slavers are going to be fighting. They're going to be fighting across my railroad. They may be blowing things up. If one side thinks I'm with the other side, they may blow up the railroad. I don't want anything to do with that. Well, as soon as investors saw that, they dumped those railroad bonds. The price of those bonds collapsed, and the banks that held those bonds as securities also collapsed. The South, however, because of its relatively light investment in railroads, suffered only minor losses in bond markets. Southern state banking systems, far more than their northern counterparts, had adopted branch banking, making the transmission of information easier and insulating them from the panic. This is the one area in which the South was way ahead of the North, was in its financial system of branch banking. The North still had unit banks that were extremely vulnerable. South learned the wrong lessons, though, from the panic, the financial upheaval. Thinking that King Cotton had protected Dixie from international market fluctuations, which had almost nothing to do with the recession, Southern leaders proclaimed that their slave-based economy not only had caught up with the North, but had surpassed it. Who needed industry when you had King Cotton? Had nothing to do with cotton. It had only to do with their branch banking system. A few voices challenged this view, appealing to non-slaveholding Southerners to reclaim their region. Hinton Rowan Helper, a North Carolina non-slaveholder, made a cogent, powerful argument that slavery crippled the South in his book, The Impending Crisis of the South, 1857. Helper touched a raw nerve as painful as that of slave insurrections. He spoke to poor whites who had not benefited at all from slavery, a ploy that threatened to turn white against white. Southern polemicists immediately denounced Helper as an incendiary and produced entire books disputing his statistics. Most of the fire eaters in the South dismissed Helper, insisting that the peculiar institution of slavery had proved its superiority to factories and furnaces. The few advocates of a modern manufacturing economy now found themselves drowned out by the mantra, cotton is king. Others, such as Jefferson Davis, deluded themselves into thinking that Southern economic backwardness was entirely attributable to the North, an antebellum version of modern third world complaints. Quote, you free soil agitators, Davis said, are not interested in slavery, not at all. You want to promote the industry of the Northeast states at the expense of the people of the South and their industry. Jeff, nobody was stopping you from creating your own industries. The only thing that was stopping you was your love of slavery. That's the only reason Southerners did not go into manufacturing, which, as I showed in a previous lesson, paid 4 to 5 times as much as did slavery. So it wasn't that you couldn't make money outside of slavery. You made a lot more money outside of slavery. They just didn't want to do it. This conspiracy view was echoed by Thomas Cattell in the Southern Wealth and Northern Profits, 1860. Another conspiracy view that increasingly took hold in the North was that, quote, a slave power conspiracy had fixed the Dred Scott case with Buchanan's blessing. No doubt the president had improperly indicated to Taney that he wished a broad ruling in the case, yet historians reject any assertions that Taney and Buchanan had rigged the outcome, although Taney had informed the president of the details of his pending decision, which was wrong. Lincoln probably doubted any real conspiracy existed, but as a Republican politician, he made hay out of the perception. Likening Douglas, Pierce, Taney, and Buchanan to the 4 home builders who brought to the work site, quote, frame timbers whose pieces just happened to fit together perfectly, Lincoln said, quote, in such a case, we find it impossible not to believe that Stephen and Franklin and Roger and James all understood one another from the beginning. It's the same thing we say today about the hoax news media. They don't need to get together in a back room and decide how they're going to cover stories. They're already there. They already know how they're going to cover stories. They all cover stories the same way because they all come out of the same little echo chamber of Harvard, Yale, Columbia Journalism School, and a few others, and they all share the same beliefs, and they all believe that MAGA Republicans are mouth-breathing Neanderthals and all that kind of stuff. So they don't need to have a meeting to know what they're going to say. They're all going to say the same thing anyway. By the midterm elections of 1858, then both sides had evolved convenient conspiracy explanations for the worsening sectional crisis. The slave power controlled the presidency and the courts, rigged elections, prohibited open debate, and stacked Kansas constitutional application according to abolitionists. As Southerners saw it, radical abolitionists and black Republicans now dominated Congress, used immigration to pack the territories, and connived to use popular sovereignty as a code phrase for free soil and abolitionism. Attempting to legislate from the bench, Taney's court had only made matters worse by bringing the entire judiciary system under suspicion of the conspiracy theorists. Okay, so that wraps up this segment. Next time, I'm going to read the Dred Scott decision. If we have time, I will also read Frederick Douglass's comment on Dred Scott. So I'll see you back here next time. Grab a copy of Patriot's History of Globalism. It's out now. If you want an autographed copy, email me at larry@wildworldofhistory.com. We have great offers up on the site for Patriot's History of Globalism, Patriot's History of the United States, Dragon Slayers, Reagan, incredible offers, all autographed. So check it out, and I will see you guys back here on Wednesday.